Why would the Stability and Growth Pact not be good for Scotland after independence?
I thought there were two really good presentations from Philippa and from Colin, and I think they have set up this presentation really well. So I think I would summarise by Colin in saying, you've given us a kind of vision for an independent Scotland. And I'm looking at the current plan that the Scottish Government have for our independent economy and saying it doesn't match that. And then from Philippa's presentation about this idea of a wellbeing economy, absolutely correct, 100% supportive of that. But the economic plan will not deliver a wellbeing economy. So I think we need to start looking at what the current plan actually is. And I'm hopefully only going to take about 10-15 minutes because I want to hear from you and I want to have a bit of a conversation. Here are my takeaways. So first one, we wrote a 23-page paper, myself and a German economist, Kent. But the takeaway is that if we adopt the Stability and Growth Pact, it's not appropriate for Scotland. We shouldn't even really be discussing it. Adopting any fiscal rules would lead to severe austerity and could ultimately derail economic independence. And I'll go into detail, Philippa, but this plan is even worse than the independence the austerity we're having at the moment and that we had under Osborne in 2010. Scotland must tailor its economic institutions, and the plan for economic independence is not fit for purpose. So I realise they're all quite big statements, and our detailed paper goes into that and explains why. But I'm going to concentrate on this one idea that's been re-emphasised in their Fresh Start paper, which was out just 2 weeks ago, that says that Scotland will align with the European Union's Stability and Growth Pact. So quick show of hands, who knows what that is? Okay, about a quarter. Okay, so I'll give you a bit of detail. So basically this says that, every year the government is not able to borrow more than 3% of GDP. Okay, so the difference between what it spends and what it taxes can't be more than 3% of GDP. And there's another bit which is 60% debt to GDP. But as an independent nation, this won't apply to Scotland because we don't know what its starting debt level will be. So we only concentrated on this idea that the government can only have 3% of GDP difference between what it taxes and what it spends. Now, this is similar to what the UK government has at the moment. And what we're going to use to explain the impact of that decision is something called sectorial balances. So sectorial balances are a macroeconomic framework. And Colin, you'll like this because it's based on accountancy. Okay? It measures all the financial transactions in an economy. And when you look at financial transactions, as everyone knows, for every debit, there's a credit. For every asset, there's a liability. So someone's deficit is someone's surplus. And when you look at the economy, you can split it into three different sectors. Public sector, the private sector, which is all of us, and the foreign sector. So if there's a surplus in the foreign sector and a surplus in the private sector, there must be a deficit where? Public sector. So it's very simple, and you'll hear a lot of economists who come up and say, this is a law or this is fact. And in economics, there's no such thing. But when you use accounting identities, you're able to say, this is true. And no economist can argue against it. If there's a deficit in one sector, it must be matched by a surplus in one or the other sector. So it's a really good place to start from analysing the impact of decisions which affect your economy. I'm hopefully close to encouraging the Scottish Government to release the sectorial balances. I had a conversation with the Chief Economist on Tuesday for an hour, and he said they'll look into doing this, which would be a really good thing for us as a clear understanding on what impact government deficits have. We wanted to look at Scotland's sectorial balances, but we had a problem. There aren't any. So we had to start them, we had to create them. Now this is roughly what the Scottish sectorial balances said for last year. So the foreign sector balance has an 8% surplus. So all that foreign direct investment that we love, the Scottish Government love, it comes in, but 8% of it goes out every year. It goes to the foreign sector. So foreign direct investment is a huge issue. And I'd like to address that question you asked about attracting investment and needing people to invest, because we don't as an independent nation. We do not need any foreign income coming in because we'll have a government which can create its own currency. And this is the huge problem that we've got. And no one in the Scottish Government has identified this or come up with a plan to approach it. Now, we have a private sector surplus of 2% of GDP. Okay, so 8 and 2 equals 10. Where does that come from? Public sector. So this deficit is Scotland's public deficit. So this is all forms of government, principally Westminster. So the reason that we have a plus 2% GDP surplus in Scotland is because we have a public sector deficit. And we need that deficit because so much money leaks out of the country. So no one had ever really looked at this before. And this is the starting position where we're likely, if we're independent in the next few years, approximately, roughly where we would be. Now, here are Scotland's sectorial balances. Because everything balances, there's a zero line along the bottom. If a sector's in surplus, it's above. If it's below, it's in deficit. So fairly simple. I mean, how many times could an economist come up and show you some exceptionally complicated graphs? Again, the beauty in this is how simple it is. But you can see how rarely the Scottish private sector net saves. And net saves is just a simple term that means that we spend less than we earn. Okay, so it's not savings, it's saving. We spend less. Look how often we're in a position as a private sector, everyone in this room, households, businesses, financial services sector, normally we don't save. Now, this is a huge issue for Scotland going forward. Now, we're only able to save, when you can see it in the blue lines. Anyone remember what happened in 2019? So huge influx of government money allowed us to save. But the issue that you can see, I think, is pretty clear. So looking at that, it's a huge issue. We've got so much money leaving the country. Okay, and the pound never leaves the country, but the ownership of the pounds leaves the country. So huge issue. But this proves why you need a public sector deficit. You need this because that money effectively has to come from somewhere. And the public sector deficit, and we say in the paper, it is what it is. If you have 8% of GDP leaving, and if you want your private sector to save 2%, then the deficit, the public deficit, has to be 10%. It's impossible. There's an accounting identity. So we're sitting at 10 at the moment. Who remembers the figure of the Stability and Growth Pact? 3. So where does that 7% come from? And that's what we addressed in the paper. So there's a desire to have this 3%, but how do we actually get there? And when we looked at all of the economic papers, we found that there's too little investigation into this transition period. How do we get from where we are now to where we want to be? And we can use GERS as a reasonable place to start. And in the latest paper, there's been a big political fudge. And they've said, actually, GERS is no use. So we're now going to say we've got no idea where Scotland's going to start its economic journey from. This is a political decision that's been made because I believe the economics are too difficult. And this is a huge concern that's come out in the Fresh Start paper. Scotland can easily have a 10% public deficit. There's no problem with that. In fact, we need that. Coming after decades, centuries of lack of investment and spending in Scotland, we need a big public sector deficit. I would be going out to the population and saying, Westminster doesn't spend enough in Scotland. A new government has to spend more. The private sector is completely debt stressed. You need government money. We need to give people a job. We need to improve the infrastructure. We need to improve. This 10% is probably going to be more because it is what it is. If you want the private sector to save, and if we want, and we're in a position where we're still sending money abroad, and we've still got a trade deficit, we need at least a 10% public deficit with independence. But the Scottish Government are saying a 3% deficit. So what does that lead to? But adopting this leads to this, and it leads to it in big red letters. It's much worse than the austerity we've got now. So let's assume we're independent, and we do in the paper, we just choose 2025 to make things easy. We're independent this year. We've got an 8% foreign sector surplus. And we move from a public sector balance of -10 to -3. Look at the difference in the private sector balance. It can only come from the private sector. So we're saving 2% of GDP right now, The government is saying to us, no, we want you to have less than 5% of GDP to allow us to get to 3%. It's just complete economic madness. So this is the decision that was made. So we thought, well, how did you get there? And this is where there's been no investigation, because we can prove that we're at 10% public deficit at the moment. And if we want to get to 3%, we can prove that it has to come from the private sector. So we said it would collapse economic growth. It would raise unemployment. It would reduce public goods and services. It would likely also increase household debt stress, disproportionately affecting the lowest earners, women, children, and minority groups. All those groups, Philippa, that you spoke about are most impacted by austerity. This is what that one decision means. So we thought, let's see what pathway. There's 4 pathways. Do you want to get to 3% after 3 years? And if you do that, government spending would have to reduce 12.5%. Okay? It's just a ludicrous, it's never happened outside of an economic disaster to 12. So we thought, well, what's the scenario 2? Let's do it over 5 years. You would have to reduce government spending by 7.5%, which is what happened to Greece after the financial crisis. Greece's GDP, although I don't like to use that, but it's a nice benchmark, is 77% now what it was in 2008. It regularly has 10% unemployment. So the second case, surely we can't do it. So the best case scenario is to get to the Stability and Growth Pact level after 15 years. But that would be 15 years of austerity at the level that we had under George Osborne. Now, that's what the Scottish Government is effectively going to the electorate and saying they want to happen. Now, it's absolutely ludicrous, and this shows a lot of things, but it shows the lack of academic rigour in any of the economic perspectives that the Scottish Government have. Because what we all want to see, the wellbeing economy, the vision that Colin said, you can't deliver it when you start to look at the detail of the current plan. I reckon it's close to 12%. And when we become independent, we will have about a 12% public deficit. How you get from 12% to 3% without huge austerity, in my mind, is impossible. And there's nothing in the government plans that explain how they do that. They've just made this statement because they think it sounds good. Now, since writing the paper, which we finished about 6 months ago, I've got further thoughts that make things even worse. So again, looking at the perspective, the fresh start, we based that on a best case scenario of 1.4% of GDP growth. And we still had the 15 years of austerity. It's likely that the growth this year in the Scottish economy would be around about 0.25%. So much worse than we suggested. This idea that you have to build foreign reserves, and the Scottish Government are talking about maybe 4 billion reserves. This just means taking £4 billion more out of the private sector. And a huge issue for us when you're looking at that 8% external balance is that so much of the material and the skills that we need for a just transition and a net zero economy have to come from abroad. So that foreign sector surplus 8% is going to go up to 10%. So if that goes up to 10% and the Scottish Government wants to have this 3%, then that's more money that has to come out of the Scottish private sector, which is me and you and everyone in this room. So these are huge issues. And then I think the final one I've got, and this is a political one, we're assuming that once we're independent in the 5 years it takes us to become a fully independent nation, that Westminster is going to say, we'll keep spending as much as we always have. We won't tax you anymore. And I think those 5 years are going to be incredibly difficult economically in Scotland, and we don't know. The UK government could just say, well, you just start collecting and paying all of your taxes now. But you have to collect in pounds. It's our currency. So, there's huge issues around that transformation which we've not identified. So things are even worse than when we looked at it 6 months ago. So my conclusion, we need to start talking to the Scottish Government about a clean slate from institutions. And this idea, which is currently the plan, that they're going to grandfather institutions. And then the Fresh Start document says we'll grandfather all regulations from the UK government, and we'll start our independent nation like that. And then if we want to get rid of them or change any of them, we need an act of Parliament to change them. So this puts you on what an economist, what we call path dependency. This just puts us on a position where it will take a decade, 15, 20 years to move anywhere near away from this neoliberal establishment institutional setup that we've got. And I worked in Westminster as well, so I know these institutions really well. And if we start adopting them, I also worked in the City of London, if we start with this position, then we've got this path dependency with the UK. But my worry is also that we look to the European Union and we start altering our institutions to fit with the European Union. Now, that might be the end destination. It might be the best thing for us, and we see it in the paper. It might be the best thing, but it might be the worst thing. But what you've got to do is start with a clean slate, build all your institutions, and then after a decade say, right, where do we go now that we have full employment, that we have proper infrastructure, that we do have a care and health service, that we do have a better educational system? Now, where do we go? And that's not the plan that the Scottish Government are proposing. I've given a little bit of detail. There's a lot of detail in the paper about what an alternative would be. So you don't have these fiscal rules. You say we're going to macro manage our economy on these four things: full employment, sustainable resource use, price stability, and economic stability. Not a 3% rule, but actually looking at how you balance the whole economy. And then finally, we note in the paper that having sterling for any period of time makes this worse. So start by saying there will be no period where Scotland as an independent nation will use the pound. On day one, we will be using our own currency. In fact, 2 or 3 years before that, we'll be issuing and using our own currency. So I wanted to kind of tie it back to this. But for me, as soon as you start looking at the detail of the economic plan, you see the huge concern. And my worry is that if we get independence, it falls flat on its face because of the poor, the neoliberal economics that underpin the whole current plan.
Thanks for that too, Willie. I'm just going to play devil's advocate for a moment. So that in order to deliver this 3% fiscal rule, what we will do, we will reduce the foreign sector surplus by focusing on building an export-led economy. Will that solve the problem?
Yes, if it was possible. And we see in the paper we're probably a decade and a half late to the export growth economy. And if you were having this 10 years ago, that's a conversation 10 years ago, it'd be easier to argue. But the idea that Scotland can all of a sudden start selling more than it brings in is not empirically based. Possibly we could export a little bit more, but the huge issue is that so much of the profit from our export sector are owned by the foreign sector. So yes, we sell more, great, but that doesn't impact the Scottish private sector positively. All it does is increase the foreign balance, because 70%, around about 70% of our whisky industry is owned abroad. So for every £7 of income that's brought, every £10 of profit, £7 leaves. So it just makes that foreign sector surplus larger. So it's not a solution under the current structure to be able to do that. And as I argue, I think that 8% is likely to increase over the next 10 or 15 years because we have no knowledge or experience on heat pumps, on a lot of areas around the green transition. So huge resources we need in this country, and they've got to come from abroad. Now, that 8% also includes money that goes to the rest of the UK. So it's not just overseas, it's outside the Scottish economy. So there's a huge issue about how much money. And a very small aside, see some of this red that comes from Westminster? A lot of it goes back into England, and we want to just kind of do the calculation, because it might be basically that everyone talking about this, the deficit in Scotland's 10%, actually, it might only really be about 5%, because 5% of that money ends up back in England. So it's an interesting bit of work for us to look at. But the fundamental answer is that won't make a difference.
I was at a very positive fringe meeting at SNP conference just over a week ago about manifesto development. And it was a very open process, and it was encouraging the members to actually participate and actually put their ideas forward for a manifesto. But Angus Robertson was also there. And he was presenting that document as a fait accompli, as a preview of the upcoming white paper. And I think it's important for all of us to bear that in mind. And I'd like your opinion as to how we, the SNP members in the room, can go about influencing that process and try to persuade those in the SNP. You were talking about speaking to the Scottish Government's chief economist. We need to persuade these people to think again.
Yeah. I invited Angus Robertson to the meeting that we had, and he said he was going to send a policy officer, and he didn't in the end. But I know how busy everyone is, so there is I wrote him a letter, he wrote back and said, this is an interesting paper, we'll send a policy person. So I do think they're engaged, but this is like, you know, the Scottish Government's driving along, and this paper just hits them like a truck, because all of their eggs are in this EU basket. And all of their eggs are in this neoliberal understanding of how the economy works. And it's completely wrong. And there's a lot of things that we've covered today, which I would love to have a little bit of time to go into, which is, you know, we're not bold enough. You know, we don't have to take ownership in companies to earn money. That's a ridiculous thing when you create your own currency. We don't need to make profit from companies. We just look at the economy like it's still you know, gold, we still live in the gold standard. We don't understand properly the power of currency and what that allows us to do. But I don't know how you guys do it. I really don't. And I think it's for you to tell us what you're going to do, because we're giving you the ammunition, and everyone in this room, but send it to your MSP and just say to them, this is a simple framework. Can you explain how the plan will ensure that the Scottish private sector can net save, which is a good thing, if we've got this balance of 8% and you're going to 3%. Just explain it. It's a simple question, and I think it's fundamentally important that we ask the right questions. And I think this paper, along with what you'll get from the currency paper, starts giving us the ammunition. And I think, you know, it's crucial that we understand this at a level that's beyond what we know our politicians are understanding is.
You say you want to start with a clean slate. How do you get to that clean slate?
Yeah.
Well,
it's very simple. You look at your institutions, and, you know, take your central bank, for example. The current plan is to just copy what the central bank, the Bank of England is, to start from there, right? And for a lot of people, that kind of makes sense. But also, you could just start and say, right, what do you want your central bank to look like? What's its raison d'etre? How does it try and control the economy? What support does it provide to private banks? There's a whole variety of things that you can do. You look at your fiscal rules and you say, well, we're not going to take 3% as a fiscal rule. We're going to look at economic rules and we're going to start designing them. So it's a really simple process that you do not... The reason that the Scottish Government has said about grandfathering it is because if you look through all of the Scottish paper, it talks about this idea of stability and reassurance. I don't quite understand it. You don't need to reassure the markets. You have to inspire the people of Scotland, and you have to explain to them how you do this. And when you understand money, when you understand currency, you can do it so much easier. But it's a simple process. It really is. You start from scratch and you say, what do we want? How will this support a wellbeing economy in Scotland in the next decade? You start from there and you change it round and you create it and you say, if we want to change any of this, if we want to bring in a good idea from England, then we negotiate it. We discuss it at Holyrood and then we bring it in. But you don't start with these institutions because they'll always be conservative. Institutions by their very nature are conservative, and we need to be bolder and braver and start with institutions that are specifically designed. And in the 22 paper, it says, one of the benefits of independence is the ability to tailor our own institutions. It says that in the same paper that says we will copy the 3% fiscal rules from the... I mean, the underlying contradictions in all of the economic papers is the big issue. You know, and they're saying this is all about getting into the European Union. But the European Union won't want us as a member when our economy is in deep recession, you know. So there's a lot of things that are contradictory in those papers, but it's a simple process.
When you come along this evening to hear Thibault Lorangeau speak, I hope he will talk about what we've just been many of the things that have been in William's talk, but presenting it in a rather different specifically monetary framework. And particularly what I'm thinking about there is that he's going to make it, he makes a distinction early on in one of his papers where he talks about the difference between gradualists and fundamentalists in the independence debate. And he makes the point indeed that gradualists, which I think is what you're picking up with the Scottish Government, are looking for evolution, are looking for continuity, and believe that gives stability and resilience. Fundamentalists, on the other hand, are looking to institutional design, believing that it's possible to jump suddenly from the current state to the new state, and by doing it in the right way, that will give the stability and the resilience which we're looking for. So many of the points which we've been discussing already, thank you for that introduction, William, emphasising sectoral balances. I would have to say my immediate thinking as an economist is, well, this is a short-run approach. We're looking at the demand side. Some of what you talked about in terms of investment and so on, I'd like to see what you're thinking about in terms of capacity growth over time, so you've got a much more dynamic framework. But important work, no one's done it yet, and certainly if you can get the Scottish Government to start publishing some more data, that would be really helpful in terms of understanding the state of the economy better and informing public debate. So thank you very much for that as an interim report, and we look forward to hearing more about you in future.